Thousands of properties in Ontario are legally recognized as having historic and/or architectural importance. Such a designation comes with protections and responsibilities. With us to understand how it works and why it might not always be as wholesome and heritage-focused as it might seem, let's welcome Stephanie Ma. She is president of the Toronto branch of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario and creative director at JIMO. That's an architecture firm that integrates design and heritage conservation. And Alex Bezikovic is here. He's architecture critic for the Globe and Mail and author of 305 Lost Buildings of Canada. Did you find the buildings, incidentally?
We're still looking.
You're still looking. Okay, good. Anyway, great to have you guys here. I know you've been on this program many times in the past. This is the first time here.
That's right.
All right, great. And your first time as well?
First time.
Wonderful. Stephanie, putting you to work right away. The heritage designation, where does that come from in the first place?
Well, heritage in general, in the broadest terms, is what we value from our past and what we want to preserve for our future generations. But in Ontario, when you hear the term heritage designation, that's specifically referring to the Ontario Heritage Act.
So it's a provincial law.
Mm-hmm. And so the intention of this is to identify, recognize, and protect sites that have cultural heritage value. So a site doesn't need to be a building, it often is, but it could also be a landscape or a district. And the way we determine if something qualifies for designation is there is criteria under the Act as well. Things like, does it have physical value? Does it have historical or associative value? Or does it have contextual value? It doesn't need to have all of those, but it needs to have some of those. And so this was enacted in 1975. Following a lot of heritage advocacy around concerns of our lost heritage sites. A notable one is Old City Hall in Toronto in the 60s, which was proposed for demolition, and of course is still with us today. So that's what it means when you hear heritage designation under the Act.
I would point out 1975 meant it was the Bill Davis government that put it in, and I only mention that because you're sitting in the Bill Davis studio right now.
Right.
He's also the godfather of TVO. Okay, in principle, Alex, a good thing that we have this act?
Absolutely it is.
Because?
Well, I mean, as Stephanie was saying, heritage is about preserving places that are important to us. And, in sort of plain language, it's either because the buildings are very good or very significant in an architectural sense, or because they have important social history attached to them, or as in the case of the old Toronto City Hall, both. And there was a moment prior to 1975 when we were tearing a lot of buildings down. In the United States and in Canada, these set of policies that are known as urban renewal involved remaking a lot of the city to remake it in a modern way, to eliminate neighborhoods that were seen as blighted, to create new infrastructure for cars, and in the process clear away a lot of buildings that were seen as not valuable. And we threw away a lot of important things in that period.
So we made some mistakes there.
We definitely did. I think the question now is whether the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction.
Okay, and your view is?
My view is that it has.
And that means what?
Well, heritage has expanded now in a way that the people who moved heritage forward in the 1960s and 70s would find very surprising. The number of listed and designated heritage buildings, even in the city of Toronto, was well into the thousands, which is far more than the original advocates of heritage preservation in that period would have expected. And on the one hand, heritage is expanding to take in more kinds of stories and more kinds of places, which is absolutely necessary. On the other hand, heritage is also becoming an obstacle to the growth of our cities, which is going to be a real problem for our housing, for the housing crisis and for the climate crisis as well.
Do you agree with that characterization, Stephanie?
I think it's a complicated situation.
That sounds like a no.
Of heritage. There's points that Alex is making that I do agree with. That we're certainly seeing instances of what we would call NIMBYism or not in my backyard attitudes that might use heritage in an attempt to block development. That exists, but I don't think that's reflective of the heritage profession, and I don't think it is the intention of heritage either.
Okay, can you just take us back? Let's say you represent a neighborhood organization or something, and you see an old building and you think it deserves to be protected, not demolished, etc. How do you get the thing designated as a heritage preservation site?
It's quite a complicated process. It's a very long process as well. And so I think when defining heritage, it's also helpful to note that a lot of buildings are heritage, but they're not heritage designated.
And that makes a difference.
Yes, designated means that there is protection under the Ontario Heritage Act.
And who does the designating?
It's a process of doing reports. The city staff will do reports into looking into, is there heritage value? How I said there's that criteria you have to go through.
But the city does it.
Municipalities will pass a bylaw to designate something.
And do you agree with him that I mean, Alex says there's thousands of places that are now receiving this designation that maybe not all deserve it. Do you agree with that?
I would say actually that I think there's a lot of buildings that are deserving of heritage designation that don't have designation yet, because it's such a long process to get that there's plenty of buildings that have heritage value that maybe haven't had time to go through this process yet, or because we have such a narrow definition of what counts as heritage. There's buildings that have a lot of cultural significance that are left out of this designation process, and a lot of diverse narratives that get excluded through the system.
Now, as you said that, did you see the look on his face when you said that?
I didn't. I'm looking at you.
You're looking at me. Well, I can tell you what he did. He got this big smile on his face, which made me think, I don't know if he agrees with that. Go ahead.
Well, it's complicated, and this is why talking about these issues, you have to bring a little bit of nuance to it, because I think that in part Stephanie's right, that there are a number of sites and sort of categories of places that we have been overlooking. The problem is that heritage over the last 40 years, I think, has gone too far in recognizing certain kinds of places. And those certain kinds of places tend to be houses that were either occupied by elites, who are currently occupied by elites, and are therefore untouchable. And so, and particularly in Toronto, large stretches of the city are now effectively unchangeable.
Can you give us an example of a house where quote unquote, an elite person once upon a time lived, and therefore the house isn't being touched now?
I mean, the entire neighborhood of Rosedale is a heritage conservation district, which, 2/3 of it are Class A heritage, so they're effectively, can't be touched in a way that's visible. Big chunks of the annex have also received the same treatment, big chunks of Cabbagetown. All of these neighborhoods that were or are now really elite neighborhoods with fairly small populations, and which have a history with the heritage preservation movement. So I guess I would say that, this is true in other places as well, that, heritage went a long way in trying to protect certain kinds of house neighborhoods built before 1940, and we've done, I think, far too much of that, while at the same time perhaps not doing enough to think about other kinds of places.
Well, can I give you an honest-to-goodness real-life example here? There's a house in downtown Toronto on the campus of the U of T on St. George Street called Mcdonald House. And it's called that because the first Prime Minister of Canada and the longest-serving Premier of Ontario both lived there, not at the same time, but they both lived in that home. Now, the U of T owns the home, and, at some point, that land is so bloody expensive, someone's going to want to rip it down and put up a condo or a student residence or something like that. Should that be allowed?
No. I mean, the short answer is no.
So you're okay with preserving that one?
Some. I think there is a certain number of places for reasons of social history or architectural history or both, and certainly that would be one. That's also a very old house, which has all sorts of significance associated with it. I think that's really clear. The problem is not when you are dealing with the most, 100 or 200 or 500 most important sites in a large city like Toronto. It's when you get down to number 3,000 and 4,000, and those ranks keep getting larger that I think we start to have a problem.
Okay, I'm going to infer that you're probably going to give me an amen on saving the Mcdonald House, right? You okay with saving that one?
Yes.
Can you give me an example of something that you think, okay, you've got a designation, but you probably don't deserve it? You want to give me an example of that?
I'm not sure I can off the top of my head. I think the challenge with this conversation, though, is that it ultimately is kind of pitting housing and heritage against each other. And I don't know that I don't agree in either direction. We need more housing. We clearly have a housing shortage. But there is a lot of value in heritage as well. And so I think that the challenge with this conversation is it's overlooking the fact that heritage and housing can absolutely work together. There doesn't need to be blocking development. And a recent example of that that people might have seen in the news is the Foundry site in West Don Lands in Toronto, where there's...
You should just, for people living outside Toronto, you should just sort of give us a bit of the
Sure.
lay of the land there.
It's an industrial heritage designated building in the West Don Lands. And
West Don Lands, which is actually in the east end of the city.
Yes.
Complicated. But anyway, there you go.
It was being demolished without notice. And the community worked together to advocate against that to make sure it was conserved. So it is conserved now. That doesn't mean that development isn't moving ahead on that site. There still will be development there. There still will be towers there. It'll be high density, which is what we need, more housing.
What did they preserve?
The industrial buildings that are designated there.
Okay. You okay with that?
Yes, well, they're preserving some of them, right? And this is actually, I think, a really good model because that's a site that's large enough to keep some of the buildings that are significant intact while also putting a new building on the site, and that building is tall. What often comes up in heritage conservation districts and in adjacent places adjacent to heritage buildings is that other sort of planning and urban design ideas come into play. And it becomes very difficult to build a large building in proximity to one that is seen as significant. So it's not just that the building or a piece of the building needs to be saved, it's that what happens around it is limited. And that to me is an idea that absolutely needs to go out the window.
Stephanie, does it make sense to protect all old buildings just because they're old?
I would say just because they're old, I'm not sure if that is the only value that buildings bring. There's certainly some value in age, but there's also a lot of other value that we need to be considering. Things like social history, cultural implications to places that are meaningful to communities. And there's also the environmental aspect. I would say it's absolutely worth taking time to consider, is demolition really necessary on every site when we are in a climate crisis right now?
But let's go back to the West Don Lands.
Sure.
What is it about the old structures that were there that date back to, a different time in the city that you think, besides the fact that they're old, makes them worth preserving?
I don't think it's age specifically for those buildings either, and I don't think we need to always focus on age because there's buildings that have architectural significance, cultural significance that are only built in the 60s and the 70s even. And so with the Foundry, it's the industrial heritage, the role that played in developing that neighborhood, in developing the city. And so there's other things beside age that we do need to be considering.
Okay. And what they have decided to preserve on the West Don Lands in the east end of the city, in your judgment, Alex, is worth preserving?
I would say so, with some qualifications.
Okay.
It's a site where not only does that site, it's a site where parts were made essentially for rail, right? And this was an area surrounded by rail yards. And the role of the railways in building the city of Toronto, as in other cities, is clearly very important. And these buildings are not of amazingly high design quality, but they are largely intact and they're worth saving. With the sort of compromise that's available there of being able to put in, some serious density on the site at the same time and sort of accomplish two goals at once.
Okay, Stephanie, let me take you to an example. In the capital city here, the Heritage Department apparently recently designated a number of storefronts on Queen Street East and the Danforth, which presumably very much restricts what kind of future development can take place in those locations. Do you think, using these specific examples, that's going to adversely affect an attempt to get more intensified housing built on those spots?
I think the challenge with that, the narrative of saying that it's blocking development there, is that, as we said earlier, there's a lot of nuance. So these properties on the Danforth are not designated buildings, they're listed buildings, and there's different meanings in that. So they don't have protection under the Ontario Heritage Act. So the process there doesn't mean that no development can happen. And the concern I have with pushing this narrative that no development will happen there is at my office, actually, we're an architecture firm, and we've had a client actually say to us, we were going to propose, we were going to develop a site there, but we heard in the news that heritage planning has stopped all development there.
And that's not accurate.
And that's not accurate. And so we had to look at the site that they were interested in and reassure them, actually, you can develop here, and there's a process behind it, and there's creative solutions we can go forward with. And so for me, as someone who wants to see a lot more housing in this city, who needs more housing in this city, it's frustrating to me to hear that misinformation is being spread.
Do you think, though, that, I'm trying to find sort of the sweet spot between you two, because he thinks there's too much heritage designation going on for inappropriate reasons, and you're not quite there yet. What do you two agree on?
I think the need for more housing and maybe the need for prioritizing what should be designated, I think.
In which case, Alex, what do you disagree on?
I think it's really a question of nuance. I think we just have to come, Stephanie was just talking a moment ago about the set of properties along Danforth Avenue, which is a commercial main street, as it's known. And it is an obstacle to redeveloping those small buildings as larger ones which contain housing.
Which you think needs to happen?
I think it absolutely needs to happen. Here is the tricky thing, though. There's some peculiar things happening in Toronto right now that are sort of specific and idiosyncratic, and we need to look at these heritage questions in a larger context. Much of the city of Toronto is effectively off limits to apartment buildings. Depending on how you do the math, there's maybe 5% of the entire city where it is theoretically legal to build an apartment building. And those places already have stuff on them, right? And one of the narrow places where it is possible to build a lot of new housing is along streets such as the Danforth. So there's one tiny little line on the map where it is possible to add some new density. And the city's heritage planners have come onto that very same line and inserted a whole lot of new regulations that make it harder to build density.
What would be your view on that, Stephanie?
I think Alex touched on a really important part about there's a lot of places in the city that we can't build in. And I think that's a bigger issue to the housing crisis, that we need to look at where we can and can't build. And so if we were to hypothetically just push this even forward, let's say that heritage doesn't exist. You can now build on any property. That wouldn't suddenly solve the housing crisis. It's a much bigger and more complicated process. You would still have people who are opposing development with a NIMBY attitude, and they would just use other reasons, things like shadows or there's noise from construction. So that would still exist. So it wouldn't solve an issue, and it would also just make our cities worse because we're overshadowing what is the value of heritage here and how it contributes to quality of living, which we also need to be considering when we're thinking about housing, and also the sustainability aspect of how important it is to be preserving buildings and reusing them when we have climate change negatively impacting us.
Let's finish up on that. We've got a couple of minutes left here, and I do want to talk about what heritage designations have to do with climate change. What's the connection?
The connection there is heritage designation in theory can sometimes block demolition, and I think we should be thinking about, do we need to be demolishing every building? Demolition has significant negative impacts to our environment. If we all can understand the idea of reusing a water bottle, then we can maybe think about how big a water bottle is compared to how big a building is. When we're just throwing away these buildings, that's an incredible amount of wasted material and wasted embodied carbon that's within these buildings. And so I think it is worth time, even in a housing crisis, to be considering, should we be demolishing this? Because we all know that as climate change progresses, the most vulnerable communities will be negatively impacted by it the most, and that's also a problem for housing. So all of these things are very complicated and connected and should be considered together.
Do you think she's made a good argument here against demolition?
I think she's made an excellent argument. I just think the way in which it interacts with heritage needs to be unpacked a little bit. It's a good example that's happening in the Annex neighborhood in Toronto right now, one of the hotbeds of heritage historically. A landlord family who owns an apartment building with about 100 units is now applying to tear it down and to replace this apartment building with a new, larger building, which will
Which would be purpose-built rental still?
I think it will be part condo and part rental. Okay. So rental to rehouse the existing tenants and new condo. So adding a bunch of density by demolishing a building that has 100+ apartments in it. And that is, in an environmental sense, crazy. And yet, at the same time, if you look at that neighborhood, right behind that building is a row of houses. Those houses have very little embodied energy. Very few people live in those houses. It would be cheaper and easier to tear those houses down and to build a new apartment building, and yet that is illegal.
And it's not going to happen under any circumstances.
It's not going to happen unless we change our planning policy, including heritage, in a way that allows for that to happen. So I think we need to look at the whole picture of thinking about, in a material sense, what are the assets that we already have, where do people live already as well, and think about maybe reconsidering some of our ideas about valuing houses, which are connected to heritage, and letting some of those go in exchange for allowing new people to move in.
What's the status of this? An attempt to take down this apartment building and replace it with something bigger?
It's in progress, and it's very likely to go forward because the way planning works in Toronto is that if you have a site that has the zoning specific regulations for an apartment building, you can put an apartment building on it. And so there are a number of developers and landlords who see this opportunity to replace an old building with a new, larger one. And depending on how that's done, I don't think it's necessarily unethical. It's certainly legal. But the fact that we have planned our cities in a way that that now makes sense is insane.
And on that note of insanity, I want to thank you two for coming in today and having a really stimulating conversation about something we don't necessarily think about every day. So thanks to Alex Bezikovic and Stephanie Ma. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.